A quiet Tuesday morning at Commerce Trust Bank in Ridgewater, Montana. An unassuming security guard sits behind his desk, reading the local paper. 3 armed men burst through the glass doors, thinking they found the perfect small-town score. But they had no idea who they just threatened. 20 minutes later, those same criminals were surrounded, outgunned, and begging for mercy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain air hung crisp that October morning in Ridgewater, Montana, a town where everybody knew everybody, and the biggest crime in recent memory was teenagers spray painting the water tower. Commerce Trust Bank sat on Main Street like a fortress of red brick and polished marble, its windows reflecting the snow-capped peaks that surrounded the valley. Inside, the morning routine unfolded with clockwork precision. Behind the modest security desk near the entrance sat Frank Bulldog Castellano, though nobody in Ridgewater knew that nickname. To them, he was just Frank, the quiet security guard who'd taken the job 3 years ago after moving to town. At 62, Frank carried himself with the careful posture of a man whose body had seen too many battles, though his weathered hands remained steady, and his grey eyes still held the alertness of someone who'd spent decades watching for trouble. Frank folded his copy of the Ridgewater Gazette, setting it beside his thermos of black coffee. The headlines were predictably mundane. Town council debates new stop sign, high school football team advances to regionals, annual harvest festival this weekend. He smiled slightly. After the life he'd lived, boring was exactly what he'd been looking for when he'd ridden his Harley into this valley and decided to stay. The bank's interior buzzed with the gentle hum of Tuesday morning business. Linda Vasquez, the branch manager, moved between her office and the teller windows with the efficient grace of someone who'd been running banks for 20 years. Her dark hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and her warm smile had earned the trust of every rancher, shop owner, and retiree in the county. Tom Bradley, the head teller, counted bills with practiced fingers while chatting with Grace Murphy, an 83-year-old widow who came in every Tuesday to deposit her pension check and catch up on local gossip. "Morning, Frank," Linda called out as she passed his desk. "How's that motorcycle of yours running? I keep hearing it rumble past my house on Elm Street." Frank looked up from his newspaper, a gentle smile creasing his weathered face. "Purrs like a kitten, Mrs. Vasquez, though I suppose that's a pretty loud kitten." She laughed, shaking her head. "One of these days, you'll have to take me for a ride." "I haven't been on a motorcycle since college." "Anytime you want," Frank replied, though something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely joking. "Fair warning, though, once you feel that freedom, it's hard to give up." Near the teller window, Grace Murphy overheard the conversation and shuffled over, her cane tapping softly on the polished floor. "Young man," she said to Frank, though at 83 she was one of the few people in town who could call him young. "I've been meaning to ask you about that beautiful machine of yours. My late husband Harold rode a Harley back in the 50s. Said there was nothing like the sound of American thunder between your legs." Frank's expression softened. "Harold had good taste, Mrs. Murphy. What did he ride?" "A 1948 Panhead, if memory serves. Black as midnight, with chrome that could blind you." Her eyes grew distant with memory. "He used to take me on rides through Glacier Park. Said the mountains looked different from the back of a bike, more real somehow." "Harold was a wise man," Frank said quietly. "The road has a way of showing you things you can't see from behind windows." What none of them knew was that Frank's own relationship with motorcycles ran deeper than weekend rides and mountain views. The modest Sportster parked outside the bank was just his daily rider, chosen for its inconspicuous appearance. Hidden in the garage behind his small rental house sat a different machine entirely, a 1976 shovelhead with custom paint and chrome that told the story of a different life. A different man. The morning continued its peaceful rhythm. Derek Walsh, a young father of 2, waited in line to deposit his paycheck from the lumber mill, scrolling through pictures of his kids on his phone. Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop made small talk with Tom about the upcoming harvest festival, while her chihuahua peeked out from her oversized purse. The scene was quintessentially small-town America, safe, predictable, and utterly trusting. Frank observed it all with the trained eye of someone who'd spent 40 years watching for trouble in places where trouble usually found you first. His posture appeared relaxed, almost lazy, but his peripheral vision never stopped scanning the street outside, noting every car that slowed down, every face that lingered too long near the windows. Old habits died hard, especially when those habits had kept you alive through decades in a world where trust was a luxury and vigilance was survival. The brass nameplate on his desk read, Francis Castellano, security, but it told only the smallest fraction of his story. It didn't mention the 23 years he'd spent as a member of the Iron Brotherhood Motorcycle Club. It certainly didn't mention the 12 years he'd served as their president, or the respect his name still commanded in clubhouses from Montana to California. Frank had traded his colors for a uniform, his brotherhood for solitude, his reputation for anonymity. But some things, once earned, never truly disappear. At 10:47 a.m., Frank glanced up from his crossword puzzle to see a white panel van pulling up to the curb outside. Nothing unusual about that. Delivery trucks came and went all morning. But something made him watch a moment longer. Maybe it was the way the driver kept the engine running, or how the passenger seemed to be studying the bank's interior through the tinted glass. Maybe it was just instinct, the kind that had kept him alive when younger, angrier men had tried to take what was his. He set down his pencil and reached for his coffee, his movement casual but purposeful. In that simple gesture, 40 years of survival instinct quietly shifted into gear. Though nobody in the Peaceful Commerce Trust Bank noticed the change, outside, 3 men in the van finished their final preparations, checking weapons and pulling on latex gloves. They had no idea that their carefully planned small-town bank job was about to collide with a force they couldn't possibly have anticipated. The quiet Tuesday morning in Ridgewater, Montana, was about to become anything but quiet. The van doors slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid. 3 figures emerged onto Main Street, their movements sharp and purposeful against the lazy backdrop of small-town morning business. Jimmy "Snake" Larson led the way, his lean frame coiled with the nervous energy of a man who'd spent too many years looking over his shoulder. At 38, Jimmy had the hollow cheeks and quick eyes of someone who'd chosen the hard road and found it harder than expected. Behind him, Pete Hawkins adjusted the baseball cap pulled low over his forehead, his thick hands checking the bulge beneath his jacket one final time. Pete was the muscle, 6'2" of prison yard conditioning wrapped in false calm. He'd done 8 years in Deer Lodge for armed robbery, and the experience had taught him that violence was just another tool, no different from a hammer or a wrench. Lou Brennan brought up the rear, his pudgy frame sweating despite the cool October air. Lou was the nervous one, the kind of man who'd stumbled into crime through desperation rather than choice. His wife's medical bills had drained their savings, and when Jimmy had offered him a cut of what he promised would be easy money, Lou had convinced himself he was just temporarily borrowing from fate. Frank watched their approach through the bank's plate glass windows, his experienced eyes cataloging details that others would miss. The way Jimmy's right hand stayed near his jacket pocket, how Pete's gaze swept the street with practiced efficiency. The telltale signs of men preparing to do something they couldn't take back. Frank had seen that walk before, in parking lots outside rival clubhouses. In the moments before negotiations turned into something uglier, Mrs. Vasquez, Frank called softly to Linda, who was reviewing loan applications at her desk. "Maybe step into your office for a moment." Linda looked up, puzzled by something in his tone. "Is everything all right, Frank?" Before he could answer, the bank's front door burst open with enough force to rattle the glass. Jimmy Larson strode through first, his movements no longer casual. In one fluid motion, he pulled a .38 revolver from beneath his jacket and pointed it at the ceiling. "Nobody move. This is a robbery." The crack of his voice shattered the morning tranquility like a stone through glass. Grace Murphy's cane clattered to the floor as she stumbled backward. Derek Walsh instinctively reached for his phone before Pete Hawkins' massive hand clamped down on his wrist. Phones on the ground. "Now!" Pete bellowed, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to project dominance in places where weakness was fatal. His own weapon appeared, a sawed-off shotgun that seemed impossibly large in the confined space of the bank lobby. Lou Brennan moved to the front door, flipping the security lock and pulling down the blinds with shaking hands. His face was already flushed with panic, beads of sweat forming along his receding hairline despite the cool air conditioning. "Everyone on the floor! Hands where I can see them." Jimmy waved his gun in a wide arc, his eyes wild with adrenaline and something that might have been desperation. The customers complied, with the terrified obedience of people whose worst nightmares were suddenly playing out in broad daylight. Grace Murphy lowered herself to the polished marble with painful slowness, her arthritis making the movement agonizing. Derek Walsh lay flat, his hands spread wide, thinking about his 2 young children and hoping they wouldn't grow up without a father. Mrs. Henderson clutched her chihuahua to her chest, the small dog trembling as much as its owner. Linda Vasquez remained standing behind her desk, her face pale but determined. "Gentlemen, please. There are elderly people here. Just tell us what you want, what I want," Jimmy snarled, swinging his weapon toward her. "Is for you to shut up and open that vault before I decide to make this more complicated than it needs to be." Tom Bradley, the head teller, raised his hands slowly. "Sir, the vault is on a time lock. It won't open until—" "Don't lie to me!" Jimmy's voice cracked with frustration. "I know how banks work. I know there's cash in those drawers, and I know you can get me more." Frank remained seated at his security desk, his posture seemingly relaxed despite the chaos erupting around him. His hands rested casually on the desktop, though anyone looking closely might have noticed how his right hand had shifted slightly closer to the desk. Drawer that contained his service weapon, a Glock 19 he'd carried faithfully for 3 years but never had cause to draw. Jimmy's attention finally landed on him, the robber's eyes narrowing with suspicion and contempt. "You! Old man, get on the floor with the rest of them." Frank met his gaze steadily, his voice calm and measured. "Son, you don't want to do this." "Not here, not today." The casual authority in Frank's tone seemed to catch Jimmy off guard. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across the younger man's face. But desperation quickly reasserted itself, fueled by whatever circumstances had driven him to this point. "Did you hear me, Grandpa? I said get on the floor." "I heard you," Frank replied quietly. "But I'm thinking you might want to reconsider your choices here. This town's got good people. They don't deserve this kind of trouble." Pete Hawkins stepped closer, his shotgun trained on Frank's chest. "The old man's got a death wish, Jimmy. Want me to help him out?" Lou Brennan shifted nervously by the door, his eyes darting between the street outside and the increasingly tense scene inside. "We need to hurry this up," he whispered urgently. "Someone's going to notice the closed blinds." Frank studied the 3 men with the clinical assessment of someone who'd spent decades evaluating threats and calculating odds. Jimmy was the leader but unstable, driven by desperation rather than careful planning. Pete was the real danger, violent, experienced, and comfortable with the weapons he carried. Lou was the weak link, already showing signs of panic that could make him unpredictable. "Listen to me carefully," Frank said, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to fill the small space. "You boys are making a mistake you can't take back, but it's not too late to walk away." Jimmy laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Walk away? Old man, do you think I came this far just to walk away? Do you have any idea what brought me here?" "I can guess," Frank replied. "Desperation makes men do things they never thought they would. But desperation doesn't have to make you stupid." The words struck something raw in Jimmy's expression. His grip on the revolver tightened, and for a moment the bank held its breath. "You don't know anything about me," Jimmy snarled. "About what I've lost, what I need. So shut your mouth and get on that floor before I shut it for you." Frank remained seated, his grey eyes steady. Around him, The hostages watched in terrified fascination as the elderly security guard faced down 3 armed men with nothing but words and an unshakable calm that seemed to come from some deep, unspoken source of strength. What none of them knew was that Frank Bulldog Castellano had faced down far more dangerous men than these 3, in places where the stakes were higher and the rules were written in blood. This wasn't his first time staring into the barrel of a gun, and something told him it wouldn't be his last. The morning's peaceful routine had shattered completely, replaced by the electric tension of imminent violence. But beneath Frank's calm exterior, 40 years of survival instinct were quietly calculating angles, distances, and possibilities. The real confrontation was just beginning. Jimmy Larson stared at the aging security guard who refused to cower, his frustration mounting like pressure in a boiler. In every robbery he'd planned, every score he'd imagined, the security was either non-existent or immediately compliant. Old men were supposed to be easy targets, especially ones wearing cheap uniforms and sitting behind desks in sleepy mountain towns. "You think this is some kind of joke?" Jimmy stepped closer. His .38 now pointed directly at Frank's chest. "You think because you've got a little badge and a polyester shirt that makes you some kind of hero?" Frank's response was a slight shrug, his hands remaining motionless on the desk. "I think you're scared, son. And scared men make mistakes." The observation hit its mark. Jimmy's face flushed red, and Pete Hawkins growled from his position near the teller windows. "Let me show this old fool what scared looks like," Pete said, pumping his shotgun with a metallic crack that made the hostages flinch. But something about Frank's demeanor was beginning to unnerve even Pete. The old man wasn't sweating. His hands weren't shaking. Most telling of all, he wasn't looking at their weapons. He was looking at them, studying them with the kind of clinical assessment that made hardened criminals uncomfortable. "Jimmy," Lou Brennan hissed from his post by the door, "we're burning time here. Just shoot the old bastard and let's get the money." Linda Vasquez, still standing behind her desk despite the chaos, found her voice. "Please, there's no need for anyone to get hurt. We'll cooperate. Just tell us what you want." Jimmy swung his attention to her, grateful for a target that made more sense. "Smart lady. Now you're talking sense. Empty those teller drawers, all of them. And don't even think about hitting any panic buttons." Tom Bradley began moving toward the cash drawers, his hands visibly trembling. "The drawers don't hold much," he said quietly. "Maybe 8,000 total. The real money is in the vault, but like I said, time lock I know." Jimmy's voice carried the bitter edge of a plan already falling apart. "How much time?" Tom glanced at the digital display on the vault door. 2 hours and 17 minutes. The number hit the robbers like a physical blow. 2 hours was an eternity in a robbery. Police response times, search patterns, roadblocks, everything they'd hoped to avoid by hitting a small-town bank was evaporating with each passing minute. Frank observed their growing panic with professional interest. He'd seen the same look on the faces of rival club members who'd walked into ambushes, on drug dealers who'd realized their suppliers were undercover cops, on young hotshots who'd bitten off more than they could chew and were just starting to understand the consequences. "Like I said," Frank repeated calmly, "it's not too late to walk away. But it will be soon." "Shut up." Jimmy whirled back toward him, his composure cracking further. "Just shut up. You don't know what you're talking about." But Frank's calm was having an unexpected effect on the hostages as well. Grace Murphy had stopped trembling. Derek Walsh was watching the security guard with growing recognition that this wasn't how terrified old men typically behaved. Even Mrs. Henderson's chihuahua seemed to sense something different about the man behind the desk. Pete Hawkins moved closer to Frank, his bulk casting a shadow across the security station. "I've dealt with tough guys before, old man. Usually ends the same way, with them not being so tough anymore." Frank looked up at him with mild interest. "Is that right? And where was that, prison?" The casual accuracy of the guess stopped Pete cold. His eyes narrowed as he tried to figure out how a small-town security guard had made that connection so quickly. "Deer Lodge, I'd guess," Frank continued conversationally. Am I right? 8 to 10 years, probably armed robbery. You've got the yard walk, the way you hold that shotgun like you've used it before. Question is, did you learn anything useful while you were inside, or are you about to make the same mistakes that got you caught the first time? The precision of Frank's assessment sent a chill through the bank. This wasn't random guesswork. This was someone reading Pete Hawkins like a book written in a language only certain people understood. How do you... Pete started, then caught himself. Doesn't matter. You're still just one old man with a big mouth. That's true, Frank agreed. But I'm also the one old man in this room who's not afraid of you. And that should make you wonder why. Jimmy's patience finally snapped completely. He lunged forward, pressing the barrel of his revolver against Frank's forehead. Because you're too stupid to be scared. Because you're some small-town nobody who thinks he's seen tough guys before. Frank didn't flinch. If anything, his expression grew more peaceful. Son, I've been shot at by better men than you with bigger guns for better reasons. And I'm still here. The statement hung in the air like smoke. Lou Brennan shifted nervously by the door, suddenly very aware of how quiet the street outside had become. No pedestrians, no cars, as if the entire town was holding its breath. Jimmy, Lou whispered urgently, something's not right here. We should go. Take what we can and go. But Jimmy was past the point of rational thinking. The job had already gone sideways, his carefully laid plans crumbling around him. The old security guard's unshakable calm felt like mockery, like judgment, like everything that had gone wrong in his life condensed into one infuriating source. You want to know what's not right? Jimmy snarled, pressing the gun harder against Frank's skull. What's not right is walking into what should have been an easy score and finding some wannabe cowboy who thinks he's tougher than he is. Frank's voice remained steady despite the cold metal against his forehead. I don't think I'm tough, Jimmy, but I know you're not as tough as you need to be for what's coming. What's coming? Jimmy laughed, but it was the sound of hysteria creeping in at the edges. What's coming is you bleeding out on that floor if you don't start showing some respect. Respect is earned, Frank said quietly. And terrorizing innocent people isn't the way to earn it. Outside, the first distant rumble of motorcycle engines began to drift through the mountain air. None of the robbers noticed it yet, but Frank's eyes flickered with something that might have been recognition or satisfaction. The digital clock on the wall read 11:03 a.m., 16 minutes since the robbery began. In Frank's experience, that was just about enough time for word to travel through certain channels, for phone calls to be made, for old loyalties to stir from their slumber. Pete Hawkins stepped back, raising his shotgun. Jimmy, maybe we should listen to Lou, take the cash from the drawers and run. This is getting weird, but Jimmy was beyond hearing reason. The pressure, the failed plan, the mocking calm of the old security guard, everything was combining into a fury that demanded satisfaction. No, he said through gritted teeth. No, we're not running from some rent-a-cop with delusions of grandeur. We're going to finish this. Frank closed his eyes briefly, as if saying a small prayer. When he opened them, something had changed. The kindness was still there, but underneath it lay something harder, something forged in places where mercy was a luxury and survival was earned through strength. All right then, he said softly. If that's how you want it. The rumble of engines was growing louder. The sound of approaching motorcycles filtered through the closed blinds and locked doors of Commerce Trust Bank, but the three robbers were too focused on their deteriorating situation to notice. Jimmy Larson's hands were shaking now, his grip on the .38 revolver slick with sweat as he pressed it against Frank's forehead. What should have been a simple 15-minute job had turned into a nightmare of delays and unexpected resistance. Tom. Jimmy barked at the head teller, who was methodically emptying cash drawers with trembling fingers. Move faster. We don't have all day. Tom Bradley fumbled with a stack of 20s. His nervousness making the simple task nearly impossible. I'm going as fast as I can, he stammered. glancing toward Frank as if the calm security guard might somehow make this all go away. But Frank remained motionless in his chair, the gun barrel still pressed against his skull, his breathing steady and controlled. To the hostages lying on the marble floor, his composure seemed almost supernatural. Grace Murphy watched him with growing wonder, remembering her late husband Harold's stories about men who'd served in Korea, men who carried a different kind of strength inside them. 8,400 and change, Tom announced, stuffing the bills into a canvas bag Lou had provided. That's everything from the teller stations. Jimmy's face contorted with rage and disappointment. $8,000. After months of planning, after crossing lines he could never uncross. After threatening innocent people, $8,000 wouldn't even cover his debts, let alone solve the problems that had driven him here. That's it? He snarled. That's all? I told you the real money is in the vault, Tom replied quietly. Time locked until 1:15 this afternoon. Pete Hawkins shifted his weight, the shotgun heavy in his hands. Prison had taught him to read situations, and everything about this job felt wrong now. The old security guard's unnatural calm, the empty streets outside. The way sound seemed muffled, as if the whole town was waiting for something. Jimmy, Pete said carefully, maybe we should take what we got and go. $8,000 is better than a life sentence, but Jimmy was past rational thought. The gun against Frank's head had become his anchor, the one thing preventing his complete psychological collapse. No, we're not walking away with pocket change. There's got to be more money somewhere. Linda Vasquez, still standing behind her desk with her hands raised, tried to interject. Sir, I can access our emergency cash reserves. There might be another 2,000. Might be? Jimmy's voice cracked. Might be isn't good enough. That's when the first police siren wailed in the distance, faint but unmistakable. Lou Brennan's face went white as he peered through a gap in the blinds. Cops, he whispered. Jimmy, we got cops coming. The news hit the robbers like a physical blow. Their carefully planned escape routes, their timeline, their entire strategy, all of it was crumbling. Jimmy spun away from Frank, waving his gun wildly. How? He demanded. Nobody triggered an alarm. Nobody made a call. Frank spoke for the first time in minutes, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Silent alarm. Triggered automatically when the front door was locked during business hours. The casual revelation that he'd known about the alarm all along, had been counting on it, sent a chill through the bank. Jimmy whirled back toward him, eyes wild with betrayal and fury. You knew. This whole time you knew. I knew a lot of things, Frank replied calmly. Like the fact that Ridgewater Sheriff's Department has a 3-minute response time to the bank. Like the fact that they've got roadblocks ready to deploy at every highway exit within 15 miles. Like the fact that you boys picked the wrong town on the wrong day. Pete Hawkins raised his shotgun, pointing it directly at Frank's chest. Maybe it's time we stopped listening to this old fool, but something in Frank's demeanor had shifted. The grandfatherly patience was still there, but underneath it lay something harder, more dangerous. He looked at Pete with the kind of assessment usually reserved for threats that needed to be eliminated. You really want to do that, Pete? Frank's use of the man's name, a name none of them had spoken aloud, froze the big man in place. You want to add murder to armed robbery? You want to go from looking at maybe 10 years to facing the needle? How do you know my name? Pete's voice was barely a whisper. Frank smiled, and for the first time it wasn't entirely kind. I know a lot of things about you, Pete Hawkins. Born in Billings, first arrest at 16 for assault. Did time in county lockup, then graduated to armed robbery. Spent 8 years in Deer Lodge, got out 14 months ago. Married to a woman named Carol, who works at a diner in Great Falls and doesn't know what you're doing today. The precision of the information sent shockwaves through the bank. This wasn't lucky guessing. This was detailed knowledge that no small-town security guard should possess. You're a cop, Lou breathed from his position by the door. Undercover cop. Frank shook his head slowly. No, Lou, I'm something else entirely. The motorcycle engines were getting closer now, their rumble unmistakable to anyone who knew the sound. Frank's eyes flickered with something that might have been anticipation. Jimmy pressed the gun harder against Frank's skull, desperation making him reckless. "I don't care what you are. I don't care what you know. All I care about is getting out of here with enough money to solve my problems." "Your problems can't be solved with money, Jimmy," Frank said quietly. "They can only be solved by making better choices. And right now, you've got one choice left. Surrender to the police when they get here, or deal with what's coming down Main Street." As if summoned by his words, the sound of engines reached a crescendo. Through the gaps in the blinds, the chrome and leather of a dozen motorcycles became visible, their riders dismounting with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before. Derek Walsh, lying flat on the marble floor, caught a glimpse through the window and felt his blood run cold. He recognized some of those faces from newspaper stories, from whispered conversations in bars and barbershops. The Iron Brotherhood had come to Ridgewater. Frank looked up at Jimmy, his gray eyes now carrying the weight of 40 years of survival in a world where respect was earned through strength and loyalty was sealed in blood. "Last chance, son. Put down the gun and walk away. Because once those doors open, this stops being about money and starts being about something else entirely." The sirens were getting closer, but they were no longer the most dangerous sound on Main Street. Outside, boots hit pavement and leather creaked as the Iron Brotherhood formed up, their presence transforming the quiet mountain town into something else entirely. Jimmy's hand tightened on the trigger, his world collapsing around him. He had no idea that he was holding a gun on a man whose word could call down thunder, whose past was written in the kind of blood that demanded answering. The breaking point had arrived. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The heavy boots of the Iron Brotherhood echoed on Main Street like distant thunder, but inside Commerce Trust Bank, time seemed suspended in that terrible moment before lightning strikes. Jimmy Larson's finger trembled on the trigger of his .38, pressed against Frank Castellano's forehead, while the old security guard sat with the calm of a man who'd faced death before and found it less frightening than most people imagined. That's when the bank's front door exploded inward. Rex, Hammer, O'Brien filled the doorway like a force of nature, 6 feet 4 inches of muscle, leather, and barely controlled violence. Behind him, the silhouettes of 11 other Iron Brotherhood members created a wall of menace that transformed the morning sunlight into something dark and predatory. Rex's scarred hands held no weapons, but his presence was more intimidating than any gun the robbers carried. Well, Rex's voice carried the weight of gravel and whiskey, each word measured and deliberate. "Looks like somebody's having a party and forgot to send invitations." Jimmy spun toward the door, his revolver wavering between Frank and the new arrivals, his mind struggling to process this impossible turn of events. "Stay back! I'll kill him! I'll kill the old man!" Rex took a step forward, his boots crunching on broken glass. "Old man?" He looked at Frank, and something that might have been amusement flickered in his dark eyes. "You hear that, Bulldog? This punk thinks you're just some old man." The nickname hit the bank like a physical blow. Grace Murphy gasped from her position on the floor. Linda Vasquez's eyes widened with sudden understanding. Even Pete Hawkins, hardened by years in prison, felt his blood run cold as the pieces began falling into place. Frank Bulldog Castellano. The name that had been whispered in fear and respect through motorcycle clubs from Montana to Mexico. The man who'd led the Iron Brotherhood through 20 years of wars, negotiations, and territorial disputes. The president who'd never lost a fight, never backed down from a challenge, and never forgotten a slight. "Bulldog?" Pete's voice cracked. "You're Bulldog Castellano?" Frank finally moved, slowly turning his head to look at Pete, despite the gun barrel against his skull. When he spoke, his voice carried a different weight now, not the gentle patience of a small-town security guard, but the quiet authority of a man who'd commanded armies of bikers across the American West. Hello? Pete. Been a while since anyone called me that. Jimmy's hand was shaking so violently now that the gun barrel rattled against Frank's forehead. I don't care what they call you. You're still just one old man, and I've still got a gun to your head. Rex laughed, a sound like breaking bottles. Kid, you have no idea what you've stepped in, do you? He gestured to the bikers behind him, their leather vests displaying the patches and colors that marked them as members of one of the most feared motorcycle clubs in the country. This old man built what you're looking at. Every man standing behind me would die for him. Some already have. The revelation was sinking in among the hostages like poison through water. Derek Walsh stared at Frank with new understanding. This explained the calm, the tactical assessment, the way he'd read the robbers like an open book. Grace Murphy thought of her late husband's stories about dangerous men who walked quiet paths, and realized she'd been sitting next to a legend. Lou Brennan was backing toward the window, his face white with terror. Jimmy, we gotta go. We gotta go right now. But Frank raised his hand slightly, a small gesture that somehow commanded the attention of every person in the bank. Nobody's going anywhere just yet. We need to settle this properly. He looked up at Jimmy, whose face was streaming with sweat despite the cool air conditioning. Son, you've got a choice to make. You can pull that trigger and spend whatever time you have left running from every Iron Brotherhood chapter from here to California. Or you can put the gun down and walk out of here breathing. There's a third option, Rex added conversationally, cracking his knuckles. You can keep threatening Bulldog, and I can show you what 40 years of loyalty looks like when it gets angry. The other bikers began spreading out through the bank, their movements casual but purposeful. They weren't rushing, weren't shouting threats. They were simply taking control of the space with the quiet efficiency of men who'd done this before. The psychological pressure was enormous, like being surrounded by wolves who knew they had all the time in the world. Pete Hawkins was the first to break. His shotgun clattered to the floor as he raised his hands. His prison-learned instincts recognizing a power structure far more dangerous than anything the state of Montana could impose. I'm out, he said, his voice barely audible. I'm done. This is crazy. Lou followed suit, dropping his weapon and backing against the wall with his hands raised. Me too, Jimmy, put the gun down. This is over, but Jimmy was beyond rational thought. The revelation of Frank's true identity, the presence of the Iron Brotherhood, the collapse of everything he'd planned, it all combined into a desperate fury that had nowhere to go but forward. No, he screamed. I don't care who he is. I don't care who you are. I need that money. I need... What you need, Frank interrupted quietly, is to understand that some lines once crossed can't be uncrossed. You're holding a gun on a man who's been brother, father, and protector to every person in this room. He gestured slightly toward Rex and the other bikers. They didn't come here for the money, Jimmy. They came here for me, Rex nodded slowly. That's right. See, when somebody threatens family, we take that personal. And Bulldog here, he's been family to all of us for longer than you've been breathing. The weight of Frank's true identity was settling over the bank like a storm cloud. This wasn't just some retired biker playing security guard. This was a man whose reputation had been built in blood and maintained through decades of respect, earned the hard way. The Iron Brotherhood hadn't come to Ridgewater by coincidence. They'd come because someone had threatened their former president, and that was a transgression that demanded answering. Jimmy's eyes darted desperately between Frank's calm face and the wall of leather and chrome surrounding him. For the first time, he was beginning to understand that he wasn't just facing robbery charges anymore. He was facing something much older and more dangerous than the law. Outside, police sirens were getting closer, but inside the bank, a different kind of justice was taking shape. The kind that had existed long before courts and badges, written in loyalty and sealed in brotherhood. Frank looked up at Jimmy one last time, his grey eyes holding depths that spoke of roads traveled, battles fought, and respect earned mile by bloody mile. Last chance, son. Choose wisely. The power had shifted completely, and everyone in the bank could feel it. The wail of police sirens reached a crescendo as Ridgewater's entire sheriff's department converged on Main Street. But what they found was unlike any crime scene in the sleepy mountain town's history. 12 Harley-Davidsons lined the curb like mechanical predators, their chrome gleaming in the morning sun. The Iron Brotherhood had claimed Main Street, and every law enforcement officer in the county knew exactly what that meant. Sheriff Tom Briggs stepped out of his patrol car, his hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon before common sense reasserted itself. He'd been dealing with bikers for 30 years, and he knew that drawing iron on the Iron Brotherhood was a good way to turn a tense situation into a bloodbath. Instead, he reached for his radio. All units hold positions. I repeat, all units maintain perimeter, but do not approach the bank until I give the word. Inside Commerce Trust Bank, the standoff had reached its breaking point. Jimmy Larson stood alone now, his .38 revolver the only thing between him and complete surrender. Pete Hawkins and Lou Brennan sat against the wall with their hands zip-tied behind their backs, courtesy of Rex O'Brien's always prepared crew. The hostages remained on the floor, but their terror had transformed into something like awe as they watched Frank Bulldog Castellano command the situation with nothing more than quiet words and the loyalty of dangerous men. "You see what's happening here, Jimmy?" Frank's voice carried the patient tone of a teacher explaining a difficult concept. "Your partners figured it out. They understood that sometimes the smart play is knowing when you're beat." Rex stepped closer, his massive frame casting a shadow across the marble floor. "Kid's got one chance left, Bulldog. After that, this stops being a negotiation." The casual way Rex deferred to Frank, despite being the current president of the Iron Brotherhood, spoke volumes about the power dynamics at play. Leadership in their world wasn't just about titles or patches. It was about respect earned through decades of proving yourself when everything was on the line. Jimmy's eyes darted between Frank's calm face and the wall of bikers surrounding him. "You think I'm scared of you? You think your little motorcycle gang scares me?" The insult hit the bikers like a slap. Several hands moved toward weapons that weren't there, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. But Frank raised one finger, a small gesture that stopped 12 dangerous men in their tracks. "Easy," he said quietly. Then he looked up at Jimmy. "Son, you just called the Iron Brotherhood a little motorcycle gang. That tells me you don't understand what you're dealing with here." Outside, Sheriff Briggs was coordinating with state police and federal agents, but his attention kept returning to the motorcycles lined up like a military formation. He'd arrested Iron Brotherhood members before, fought them, even earned their grudging respect over the years. But he'd never seen them mobilize like this. Something significant was happening inside that bank. Frank continued his patient explanation, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "These men didn't ride here for money, Jimmy. They didn't come for glory or excitement. They came because when you threatened me, you threatened family. And family is the only thing that matters in their world." Grace Murphy, still lying on the cold marble floor, found herself studying Frank's face with new understanding. The kindness was still there, the gentle smile that had made her feel safe during her weekly visits. But underneath it lay something forged in places where mercy was rare and strength was the only currency that mattered. "Bulldog," Rex said, his voice carrying a note of impatience. "Cops are setting up outside. We need to wrap this up." Frank nodded, then looked directly at Jimmy. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to put that gun down, and you're going to walk outside with your hands up. The police are going to arrest you, and you're going to serve your time. But you'll serve it breathing, and that's more consideration than you've earned. And if I don't—" Jimmy's voice cracked with desperation. Rex answered before Frank could. "If you don't, then what happens next isn't about robbery anymore. It's about respect and disrespect." He let the sentence hang in the air like smoke. The psychological pressure was enormous. Jimmy was alone, outgunned, and facing men whose reputation had been built over decades of surviving situations exactly like this one. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that the money had never been the real issue. He'd walked into something much larger and more dangerous than a simple bank robbery. Frank stood up slowly from his chair, the gun still pressed against his forehead. The movement was casual, almost lazy, but it demonstrated a level of confidence that spoke louder than any threat. Here was a man so certain of his safety that he could ignore the weapon aimed at his brain. "Jimmy," Frank said, his voice carrying paternal disappointment, "your choices brought you here. But they don't have to define what comes next. Put the gun down, walk away, live to make better decisions." Outside, the police perimeter tightened, but Sheriff Briggs held his men back. He'd seen enough in 30 years to know that sometimes the best law enforcement was letting dangerous men handle dangerous situations. The Iron Brotherhood had never been saints, but they followed a code that often aligned with justice, even if their methods wouldn't hold up in court. The moment stretched like a guitar string under tension. Inside the bank, 12 hardened bikers waited with the patience of predators, while hostages held their breath and wondered if they were about to witness a man's last seconds on Earth. Finally, Jimmy's nerve broke completely. The revolver clattered to the floor as his legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed to his knees, sobbing with the kind of desperate fear that comes from staring into an abyss and realizing how close you came to falling in. "Please," he whispered. "Please, I needed the money. My kid's sick and the insurance. Please don't hurt me." Frank looked down at the broken man with something that might have been compassion. He'd seen desperation before, understood how it could drive good people to bad choices. But understanding didn't excuse the choice to threaten innocent lives. "Nobody's going to hurt you, Jimmy. You're going to jail, but you're going to live. That's more than you had any right to expect 5 minutes ago." Rex gestured to 2 of his men, who moved forward to secure Jimmy with the same zip ties they'd used on his partners. The robbery was over, ended not with violence, but with the overwhelming presence of men who understood that sometimes justice came from sources the law couldn't touch. Frank walked to the front door and unlocked it, his movements casual despite the dozens of police weapons trained on the building. Sheriff Briggs approached cautiously, his respect for Frank evident in his careful posture. "Bulldog," the sheriff nodded. Hell of a thing, Frank agreed. "But it's over now." The hostages were helped to their feet, shaken but unharmed. The 3 robbers were led away in handcuffs, their dreams of easy money transformed into the reality of hard time. And on Main Street, 12 motorcycles prepared to disappear as quickly as they'd arrived, leaving behind only the memory of what happened when someone threatened family. Justice, Iron Brotherhood style, had been served. The silence that followed the departure of the police cars and the rumble of 12 motorcycles fading into the Montana mountains felt almost sacred. Commerce Trust Bank stood open to the afternoon air, its broken doorframe and scattered papers the only physical evidence of the morning's drama. But the real changes weren't visible. They lived in the minds and hearts of everyone who'd witnessed what happened when quiet strength met desperate violence. Linda Vasquez sat in her office, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. She'd managed banks for 20 years, dealt with robberies, threats, and every kind of financial emergency imaginable. But nothing had prepared her for watching her elderly security guard face down 3 armed men with nothing but words and an unshakable calm that seemed to come from some deep well of experience she could barely imagine. "Mrs. Vasquez." Tom Bradley appeared in her doorway, his face still pale from the morning's events. "The FBI agents want to go over the security footage again. They're having trouble believing what they're seeing." Linda nodded absently. She understood their confusion. The footage would show 3 desperate men with weapons, a room full of terrified hostages, and one grey-haired security guard who'd sat through it all like he was waiting for a bus. What the cameras couldn't capture was the weight of Frank's presence. The way his quiet authority had filled the space and made everyone, robbers and victims alike, understand that they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. "Tell them I'll be right there," she said. Then after a pause, "Tom, did you know? About Frank, I mean." About who he really was. Tom shook his head slowly. Not a clue. I mean, I knew there was something different about him. The way he watched the street, how he never seemed rattled by anything. But Bulldog Castellano, former president of the Iron Brotherhood? He whistled softly. That's not exactly the kind of thing that comes up in casual conversation. Down the street at Murphy's Cafe, Grace Murphy held court at her usual table, surrounded by half the town as she recounted the morning's events for the dozenth time. At 83, she'd become the unofficial historian of Ridgewater, and this was the biggest story she'd ever had to tell. I'm telling you, there was something about him from the very beginning, she insisted. Her weathered hands animated as she spoke. The way he carried himself, the way he looked at people. My Harold always said you could tell a man's true character by how he handled pressure. Well, Frank Castellano handled it like he'd been born for it. Derek Walsh sat at the counter, nursing a beer despite the early hour. He'd called in sick to the lumber mill, unable to face the routine normalcy of his job after what he'd witnessed. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Frank's calm face as that gun barrel pressed against his forehead. The absolute certainty in the old man's voice when he'd warned the robbers they were making a mistake. Grace, Derek said quietly. When those bikers showed up, when they called him Bulldog, I've never seen anything like the way they looked at him. Like he was royalty or something. Grace nodded knowingly. Respect, honey. Real respect. The kind you can't buy or demand, only earn. And that man earned it the hard way, I'd wager. At the sheriff's department, the three robbers sat in separate cells, each processing their spectacular failure in different ways. Pete Hawkins lay on his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile the quiet security guard he'd threatened with the legendary Bulldog Castellano. Prison had taught him to recognize dangerous men. But Frank had been on a completely different level. Dangerous not because of what he might do, but because of what he represented. Lou Brennan paced his cell like a caged animal, muttering prayers and promises to himself. The image of those 12 bikers filing through the bank's broken door would haunt his dreams for years to come. He'd thought he was desperate enough to risk anything for money, but desperation was nothing compared to the kind of loyalty Frank commanded. Jimmy Larson sat with his head in his hands, tears streaming down his face. The weight of his choices pressed down on him like a physical thing. He'd held a gun to the head of a legend, threatened to kill a man whose word could summon armies. The fact that he was still breathing felt like a miracle he didn't deserve. Sheriff Briggs finished his report and leaned back in his chair, exhaustion settling over him like a heavy coat. The FBI agents had asked 1,000 questions, trying to understand how a simple bank robbery had turned into something that looked more like a diplomatic negotiation between sovereign powers. "Sheriff," Agent Martinez had asked, "what's your read on this Castellano character? Is he a threat to the community?" Briggs had considered the question carefully. Frank Castellano was many things: former outlaw, respected leader, man of violence when necessary. But after 3 years of watching him work quietly at the bank, helping elderly customers, never causing trouble, Briggs had formed his own opinion. "Agent Martinez," he'd replied, "Frank Castellano is probably the most dangerous man in this county. But he's also the most honorable. In my book, that makes him exactly the kind of man we need watching over folks." The town's reaction to the revelation was complex and revealing. Some residents felt betrayed, as if Frank had been living a lie among them. But most found themselves oddly proud that such a legendary figure had chosen their quiet community for his retirement. It was as if Ridgewater had been secretly protected by a guardian they never knew they had. At the Coppermine Saloon, the afternoon crowd buzzed with speculation and admiration. Frank's regular booth, where he'd sat every Friday evening for 3 years, nursing a single beer and reading paperback westerns, had become an impromptu shrine. Bartender Mike Collins found himself fielding questions about every conversation he'd ever had with the man. He never talked about the old days, Mike told anyone who'd listen. Never bragged, never told war stories. Just sat there quiet, tipped well, and treated everyone with respect. Now I understand why. When you've lived the kind of life he lived, you don't need to prove anything to anybody. The lesson wasn't lost on the community. In an age of loud voices and social media posturing, Frank Castellano had demonstrated the power of quiet strength. He'd shown that true authority didn't need to announce itself, that real power often wore work clothes and carried a modest paycheck. Linda Vasquez made a decision that afternoon that would define her tenure as bank manager. When the corporate offices called to discuss replacing Frank with more appropriate security personnel, she'd cut them off mid-sentence. "Mr. Henderson," she'd said to the regional vice president, "with all due respect, there is no more appropriate security personnel. Frank Castellano has protected this bank, this community, and these people for 3 years. What happened today just proved that we've had the best protection money can't buy." As evening approached, Frank Castellano returned to his modest rental house on Elm Street, parking his Sportster in the same spot he'd used for 3 years. Neighbors who'd exchanged casual waves now watched from their windows with new understanding. The quiet man who'd helped Mrs. Patterson with her groceries, who'd shoveled snow from the elderly Morrison's driveway, who'd fixed young Billy Chen's bicycle chain, that same man had faced 3 armed robbers with the calm of someone who'd stared death in the face and found it less frightening than most people imagined. The morning's events had revealed something profound about the nature of strength, respect, and the masks people wear to navigate the world. In a single morning, Ridgewater had learned that heroes don't always look like heroes, that power often hides behind humility, and that the most dangerous men are sometimes the gentlest. The town would never be quite the same. But then again, neither would anyone who'd witnessed what happened when legends walked among ordinary people, protecting them with nothing more than quiet presence and the loyalty of those who understood what honor really meant. Some lessons once learned change everything. 6 months after the morning that changed Ridgewater forever, Frank "Bulldog" Castellano sat at his usual security desk in Commerce Trust Bank, reading the local paper and sipping black coffee from his thermos. To a casual observer, nothing had changed. The same modest uniform, the same gentle smile for customers, the same quiet presence that had defined his 3 years in the mountain town. But everything was different now. The bronze plaque beside the front door told part of the story. In recognition of Frank Castellano, whose courage and dedication protected our community, on October 15th. What it didn't say was that the plaque had been Linda Vasquez's idea, approved unanimously by the town council despite Frank's protests that he'd only been doing his job. Morning. "Frank," called Grace Murphy as she made her weekly deposit, her cane tapping familiarly on the marble floor. At 84 now, she moved a little slower, but her eyes still sparkled with the sharpness of someone who'd witnessed history in the making. "Morning. Mrs. Murphy, how's the arthritis treating you?" "Better, now that I know I've got a genuine hero watching over me," she replied with a wink. "Though I suppose you always were, we just didn't know it." Frank's smile carried a touch of embarrassment. Fame, even small-town fame, sat uncomfortably on shoulders that had carried much heavier burdens in private. But he'd learned to accept the community's gratitude with the same grace he'd once accepted the loyalty of dangerous men. The bank had become something of a pilgrimage site for motorcycle enthusiasts. Bikers from across the country would make detours to Ridgewater, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary Bulldog Castellano in his unlikely retirement. Frank treated them all with the same courteous professionalism he showed everyone, though observant visitors might notice how his posture subtly shifted when men in leather vests walked through the door, not with suspicion, but with the recognition of shared experience. Tom Bradley approached the security desk, carrying a stack of paperwork and wearing the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd shared extraordinary circumstances. The relationship between Frank and the bank staff had evolved beyond mere collegiality into something approaching family. "Frank, there's a reporter from the Helena Independent Record on line 2. Wants to do a follow-up story about the quiet hero of Ridgewater. Frank shook his head with patient resignation. Tell them what I told the last 5. I was just doing my job. The real heroes were the people who kept their heads when things got scary. It had become his standard response to media inquiries, a deflection that revealed more about his character than any interview could. In a world obsessed with celebrity and self-promotion, Frank Castellano remained committed to the shadows, more comfortable with respect earned quietly than recognition proclaimed loudly. Derek Walsh entered the bank. Now a regular visitor despite having no real banking business, the young father had found himself drawn to Frank's presence, seeking something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was the security of knowing that men like Frank existed in the world, protectors who asked for nothing and gave everything when the moment demanded it. Afternoon. Frank, coffee's on me at Murphy's when you get off shift. It had become a ritual between them, these afternoon conversations, where Derek asked questions and Frank provided answers without ever quite revealing the full scope of his experiences. The younger man was learning lessons about strength, responsibility, and the difference between looking tough and being tough. I'd like that. Derek, fair warning though, Mrs. Murphy's been practicing her stories about the robbery. You might be there for a while. The 3 robbers had received sentences that reflected both the seriousness of their crimes and the mercy implicit in their survival. Jimmy Larson, the ringleader, had been given 15 years, but was already showing signs of genuine rehabilitation. Prison counselors reported that he spoke frequently about the security guard who saved my life by not letting me throw it away. Pete Hawkins had received 12 years, which he was serving quietly in the state penitentiary. Word had somehow reached the prison population about his encounter with Bulldog Castellano, earning him a respect that transcended the usual hierarchies of incarceration. When you'd faced down a legend and lived to tell about it, even hardened criminals listened to your stories. Lou Brennan had been sentenced to 8 years, but would likely serve 5 with good behavior. His wife Carol visited regularly, and their marriage had somehow survived the revelation of his criminal activities. Perhaps because she understood, as the whole town now did, that good people sometimes made terrible mistakes, and redemption was possible for those willing to face the consequences of their choices. Rex Hammer O'Brien had stopped by the bank twice since the incident, each visit brief and respectful. The current president of the Iron Brotherhood understood that Frank had chosen a different path, but the brotherhood between them remained unbroken. Some bonds transcended circumstances, geography, and time itself. Bulldog, Rex had said during his last visit. You ever need anything at all, you know where to find us. Frank had nodded, knowing he likely never would, but grateful for the knowledge that family, once earned, lasted forever. As evening approached, Frank prepared for the end of another quiet day. The bank's customers had been served, its assets protected, its people kept safe. It was honest work, meaningful work, the kind that let a man sleep soundly, regardless of what shadows might haunt his past. Linda Vasquez stopped by his desk as she prepared to lock up. Frank, I've been thinking about what happened that morning. About how you stayed so calm, so in control. Where does that kind of strength come from? Frank considered the question, his grey eyes distant with memory. I think it comes from understanding that strength isn't about what you can do to other people, Linda. It's about what you'll endure to protect them. Once you know that about yourself, really know it, there's nothing left to be afraid of. She nodded, though he suspected she didn't fully understand. Few people could, without having walked the roads he'd traveled, made the choices he'd made, carried the weight he'd carried for so many years. The truth was simple and complex. Frank Castellano had found peace not by running from his past, but by transforming it into something useful. The skills that had once served violence now served protection. The loyalty that had once bound him to outlaws now connected him to ordinary people living ordinary lives. The strength that had once been wielded for conquest was now offered freely in service. That night, Frank rode his Sportster home through streets that knew his name, past houses where children played safely because of choices he'd made and prices he'd paid long before they were born. The mountains stood eternal against the star-filled sky, and the road stretched ahead with the promise of another quiet day in a life finally at peace with itself. The legend of Bulldog Castellano would outlive the man, becoming part of Ridgewater's identity, a story told to children about the difference between seeming strong and being strong. But Frank himself had already achieved something more valuable than legend. He'd found a way to use everything he'd learned in the service of something larger than himself. In the end, perhaps that was the most revolutionary act of all. A dangerous man choosing to be gentle, a legend choosing to be ordinary, a warrior learning that the greatest battles are won not with violence, but with the quiet courage to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The story had become legend, but the man had become something even more precious, a guardian who asked for nothing and gave everything, one quiet day at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.